That money goes into our investment accounts, and our investment accounts provide the bulk of the money that we raise. Let's think. In the last 5 or 10 years, perhaps, we have made significant donations for the steeple, for the repair of the roof, for the repair of the lead lining that was stolen from the roof, and we've contributed £25,000 towards the organ restoration and refurbishment. So we do things that are not always obvious to everybody else, but we rely on the investment income, we rely on events such as today raising money for us, and we also have subscriptions. There's a subscription form on the table at the back there where you came in, and there's a gift aid part to the form if any of you would like to sign up to donate to our cause. I have been asked by Vicar Janice to mention the fact that there is going to be an organ recital in the church on the 7th of May, and there's a notice on one of the pillars over here, which you can see. It's being given by an organist from Liverpool who is coming down to give the first recital we've had on the new organ. So perhaps you'd like to make a note in your diaries and look at Contact magazine if you get it, which tells you all about what's going on. Well, we're very privileged today to have Professor Sir Martin Landray coming to talk to us, and the title of his talk is really quite intriguing in that he is going to talk about recovery and finding treatments in a crisis. As many of you may know, Professor Landray is a lifelong Bamptonian. He followed his parents into the medical profession, and he studied medicine at University of Birmingham. He is now Professor of Medicine and Epidemiology, I had to put my teeth in for that one, at the University of Oxford, and he's a consultant at the John Rodcliffe Hospital, where he sees patients with heart disease. And for you that know Dixie Dean, he's been keeping him going for quite a few years. Dixie is now 91, and we're relying on you to keep him going until he's 100. If you haven't seen Martin around the village, I bet you have, but you haven't noticed, that he is one of the Morris dancers and can often be seen on Morris dancing events out in the village square, where he performs with all his team. For the last 2 years, Martin has led the recovery trial. It's the world's largest trial of possible treatments for COVID-19, leading to the discovery of treatments that are now used around the world. Last year, he was very deservedly knighted in the Queen's Birthday Honours List for his services to public health and science. And Martin, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Very nice to see so many people here. I thought I'd give you a little flavour of what the last 2 years, if you like, have been like. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, and then some of the challenges we were facing, and how we went about resolving them. And I recognise it's a very mixed audience. Some are very familiar with clinical trials. Indeed, Barbara, who I think runs the Flower Guild, is a star of the recovery trial, even in her retirement. So I recognise that some of you are very familiar with this sort of subject, and others much less so. And I'll do my best to get the right balance. We've got questions afterwards, so we can deal with things at that point. So the recovery trial and the origins, if you like. So as has been pointed out, I'm sort of Bampton at heart. I don't know if you can see the picture that well at the back, but there's my father, and my mother, and a very little me, from about 1973, I should think. Dad and Mum moved into Bampton in 1964, when general practice was a very different thing from what it is today, and from what he's told me, in that first year he was in the medical practice here, he did 100 home deliveries. So the world has moved and changed. Medicine has changed dramatically over the last, whatever that is, 50 or 60 years. But it did mean that medicine was all around me. Growing up at home, on Saturdays and Sundays when he was on call, and the house phone would ring, my mother would take the calls, and many of the patients would come to the front door and were seen quite literally in the house, and when he wanted to examine them, they literally lay on the couch in the sitting room. The only time my mother used to get cross was if the patients bled on the carpet. So, medicine was all around me, and that was very much part of my inspiration. I want to take you to, sorry the pictures don't broadcast as well as they do on the screen, but this is the Bampton, Clanfield, Filkins, Alderscote, Kencote and Easter Inquirer of 1980. So this was a children's newspaper which was run under the auspices of what was then West Oxfordshire Arts Association, is now Oxfordshire Arts. It was a children's newspaper in which children would come to to our house, and around the ping pong table would come up with the stories they were going to write about them. It was all typed up. It was then sent off to the printing, the Oxford Mail Prints in Oxford, and these newspapers were sold around the village. And the headline stories of April 1980 were on the left, the Moscow Olympics following the Russians having invaded Afghanistan, and on the right, the tensions around whether the M40 was ever going to go any further north than Oxford. So those are the headline stories of 1980. But if you turn the page inside, that's me as I moved on from Bampton School to St News, on the inside was this article called Germ Warfare, which actually, the source of information was my father, and I was interested in how the body battled infections. And so I wrote this piece about germs. I even drew a picture of a germ, just so that we could all be quite clear what we were talking about. That was my first and ever scientific publication. I believe there is a copy in the Bodleian Library. Seriously. And I didn't write another publication on infectious diseases for 40 years. But if you look at that, and again I'm sorry it doesn't project so well, the germ warfare article is up in the top left-hand corner. In the middle there is this article, you can see just about a pony and a girl with a riding hat on in the middle, and the title, Robin is Wonderful. And it turns out that that girl was none other than Deb Irvin, who turns out some years later to end up being Lady Landray. So, after progressing to Abingdon School, I can't find any photographs of my time at Abingdon School, at least none that could be shown in public here. I did find the school time. After that, I went on to Birmingham Medical School, in fact, the same medical school that my parents had been to. And here's me on, I think, day one on the wards. And one of the things that happened at the medical school there was we had a wonderful teacher of clinical pharmacology, the way that you use drugs. I don't mean abuse drugs, I mean use drugs as a doctor. And he took a very practical view of the teaching. And as patients, and some are medics, but you may or may not recognise this dilemma that every doctor has pretty much every time they see a patient. Should I prescribe a treatment? Most of the time the answer is no. But sometimes the answer is yes. And then the question comes, which treatment? How do I know it works? How long should I take it for? What side effects should I look out for? How do I check for them? How do I monitor for them? What do I tell the patient? And so many other things beyond. And those questions, we all go when we go to see the doctor, we assume the doctor just knows the answer. And if they don't know the answer, we assume they look it up in their book, or in the web on Wikipedia, like everybody else. And the question is, how do you know that that information there is really true? How does the information that is now sort of taken as fact around whether statins prevent heart attack, they do, or whether vitamins prevent heart attack, they don't, how do we take those things which are now fact, if you like, or in inverted commas fact, how do we get to that point in the first place? And the answer to that is randomised trials, or much of that. So I'll take you through this, and I realise that this is a sort of new concept for many of you. And I was trying to think of an example. So the best example I could, well, maybe it's not the best example I can think of, maybe you've got better ones, but does a doctor recommending that you eat more broccoli, does that actually prevent you from going on and getting chest infections? It's not a completely crazy thought. You could come up with a story as to why that might be the case. Again, about vitamins and about healthy diet and so on and so forth. You can also come up with plenty of stories why that might not be the case. You could do a study, we could do one now, and say, well, how many people actually eat broccoli on a regular basis? And then we can ask them how many chest infections they get, and the people who don't eat broccoli on a regular basis, how many chest infections they get. But the problem is that those are two different sets of people for two completely different sorts of reasons. One is one lot eat broccoli and the other don't, but there will be differences in how old they are. There will be differences in what other diseases they've got. There will be differences in whether they're men or women. There will be differences about whether they read the sort of literature that tells you that eating broccoli and other good things is a good idea or not. So just doing that doesn't really give you the answer. Same would be true if we were thinking about a new drug. How do we know a new drug works or not? You could study the people who take it and the people who don't. You wouldn't have much idea. Randomised trials work like this. They take a large group of people, and instead of comparing those who do or don't take some treatment, they say, look, everybody's going to get the best the NHS can offer. But then we're going to toss a coin, and if it comes down heads, we'll give them this extra drug. And if it comes down tails, we'll just continue to give them the best that the NHS can offer. And after the end of the study, we'll then work out what proportion of the people where it came down heads did well, and what proportion of the people where it came down tails did well. And you compare the two. And there are then only two possible explanations. One is the differences are down to chance. That's where statistics comes in. That's probably my last mention of statistics, so you can relax. The other is that it's down to the difference in the treatment itself. There's something about the treatment has actually reduced the chances of having a chest infection or going into hospital or whatever else it might be. So that's how randomised trials in general terms work. And I, and Dr. Barbara and others, have run many trials where we found that when it comes down heads and you get the special treatment, the new treatment, you're better off. We've also run many trials where when it comes down tails, you're actually better off because the new treatment has side effects. And we've run most of our trials where there's actually frankly no difference between them. So most treatments that people think up as being great ideas turn out to basically be pretty useless. So this is how we can tell whether statins prevent heart attacks or don't. Because when people did that experiment, it came down heads and said statins prevent heart attacks. So get a statin, those people had fewer heart attacks than those people when it came down tails. So I realise that's a sort of digression, that's nothing to do with COVID, but that's the background to the scientific method, if you like. Now, let's go back 2 years. Let's go back to the 28th of February 2020. I was on a train, I was emailing Sir Jeremy Farrar, who's head of the Wellcome Trust and quite a well-known figure, having been on stage and very often on the television over the last couple of years, an expert in infectious disease, and particularly outbreaks like SARS and COVID and so on. And I said to him at the bottom of a long email about something completely different, I said, P.S. In other matters, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on the role that these randomised trials would have as the COVID-19 epidemic evolves. At some point, bear in mind this is still 6 weeks or so before, 4 weeks before we had lockdown in the UK, things were quite different at that point. At some point, there will be areas of important uncertainty about which of many prevention or treatment strategies we should be deploying. We should prepare for that just as we need to prepare for everything else. So this is a point where people will worry about whether we should reduce the number of flights, whether we should limit travel and so on, and large gatherings and so on. A long time before we actually did anything about it. And then I said, well, thinking back to the original modern trial of an antibiotic for tuberculosis of 1948, it was exactly when resource was limited. In those days, they didn't have much of this antibiotic to treat people. Health consequences were important. In those days, people with tuberculosis did badly. and that therapeutic benefit, does the treatment work, was uncertain, that these randomised trials provide an ethical and scientifically robust solution. And I also said, it's during times of system stress, the advent of COVID was certainly one of those, as we all know, that regulatory and governance bodies are prepared to innovate and allow this to happen. And he instantly wrote back and said, you better speak with Peter Horby. Now, Peter is a professor of emerging infections, new infections that nobody's seen before. He's done almost all his work overseas, largely in Singapore and Vietnam, but he was also involved in the Ebola outbreak and the MERS outbreak in the Middle East and so on and so forth. But he never run big clinical trials, and certainly never run any clinical trials in the UK. And that partnership is really what's led and driven what I'm going to tell you about recovery. So what did the world look like? Well, it was quite clear by the beginning of March that the tsunami was coming. The serious newspapers were covering the disaster that was unfurling in northern Italy, where they were running out of ventilators to the point that people were not being put on them, to the point where people who were on them were being taken off them, and to the point where the mortuaries were so overfull that there were refrigerated lorries in the hospital car parks. That was what was happening in February and early March 2020 in Italy. Still, many people were thinking of this as somebody else's problem. A very British reaction, of course, was highlighted by the middle two newspapers. They're being don't be so selfish, and now it's rationing. The UK was worrying about whether we had enough toilet paper. Jeremy Fowler and I were commuting to Welcome Trust building. We happened to get the same train, but then we met on the number 18 bus between Marylebone Station and the Welcome Trust building in Euston. This has been later been described as the bus journey that saved 1 million lives. I think we'll come back to that in a moment. But during the course of that 10-minute journey, we were exchanging stories, not of the middle column, but of the left-hand column, of what was happening in northern Italy, the lockdowns, the tragedy and so on, the overwhelming sense of we don't know what we're doing, reality, we don't know what we're doing, and said, look, this tsunami is coming to the UK and will be like this in 2 weeks. And it turned out, of course, that 2 weeks later we were heading into lockdown. The tsunami did hit the UK, London first, then other parts of the country. And the reality is that we didn't know which treatments would work and which ones would not. So we were faced, and I realise it's probably hard to see some of this in the background, so the pictures matter occasionally, but I'm hoping my words will convey. We've faced an unprecedented health challenge. This was the first pandemic of this scale, certainly in the UK, we've seen in a century. We were looking ahead, not looking forward, to an overstretched health service where we didn't know if we'd run out of beds, out of staff, or out of ventilators. It turns out we didn't quite run out of any of those three, but it was a close run thing. That there would be huge time pressures and emotional and personal stress for frontline medical staff. And that there would be huge numbers of unwell, anxious, very sick, often elderly, and always alone patients. And in that context, we needed to know, could we find any treatments that worked at all? So we have this major public health crisis. Back in spring 2020, 1 in 4 patients who were admitted to hospital with COVID sadly did not make it through that hospital stay alive. 1 in 4. For people who were so sick they required a ventilator, it was more like 1 in 3. And yet there was this huge uncertainty about treatment. Of course we didn't know how to treat this disease. It's a new disease. We've never seen it before. There are many candidate drugs. I've been sent hundreds of suggestions of drugs, from simple things like aspirin through to complicated things like advanced chemotherapy. But I've also been sent suggestions for beeswax from Malta and for snake venom from the States. Many, many ideas about what treatments could or couldn't work. Now, some of those you can clearly filter out as being just crazy. Others you could filter out as saying, well, they may or may not work, but we've got a public health crisis, There's no way that a treatment you could give to perhaps 5 people on in an entire hospital was going to be suitable. But there are many others beyond that too. Many, many opinions and no reliable data. And it struck Peter and I that there was unlikely to be a single big win. If there had been a big win, a single drug that you just give and the disease goes away, then we'd have known about that when the pandemic was in China or in northern Italy. We were not going to know about that. It was unlikely to be that. But if we could find a series of drugs, each of which chipped 1/5 of the risk of dying, then at this scale, and then when used in combination, that could turn out to be very, very powerful indeed. So let's say we took mortality, death during hospital, from 25 out of 100 to 20 out of 100. That's 5 lives saved for every 100 people treated. But remember how many millions and millions and millions and millions of people around the world require treatment. So what we needed was large-scale randomization. And to sort of illustrate this, there is, of course, our motivation of the hour, President Trump, who was, among others, was expounding the virtues of hydroxychloroquine. It's really important to recognise he was not alone in this. And the US wasn't alone in this either. And I realise this hasn't shown at all. But this is the sort of logic that he was giving. But forget it's Trump. Actually, maybe you would think the same thing too. So I heard about this patient. She was just in horrible shape for 12 days, 14 days. She thought she was dead. She implored her husband to obtain hydroxychloroquine, a treatment we normally use for malaria, have done for decades, very, very widely used drug. And the husband did so. 4 hours later, she awoke and she said, "I feel better." The way she spoke, it made me like a miracle. And this was not a fan of mine, but she's a fan of mine now. So that story, although it's easy to caricature, partly because of who's telling it, in reality that's so easy to come up with. I know a friend of a friend who they took this thing and suddenly they were better. Isn't that great? The reality is that many people got better on their own, and many treatments have little or no effect, and some are downright harmful. So, as I say, he wasn't alone. On the left is a doctor from southern France, from Marseille, called Didier Raoult, who took on a sort of hero status. He had more followers, almost than Trump, to be honest. His daily media updates on how to tackle COVID had more followers than government official pronouncements, particularly in France. Macron met him, which was a controversy. Bolsonaro, that's the middle slide, Bolsonaro in Brazil also brought this story. Hydroxychloroquine is very, very widely used because it must work. One, it must work, and two, because of this crisis, we haven't got time to find out if it doesn't. Hang on a moment. So, what did we do? We did this trial. We said, look, let's not just throw treatments at people in the hope that they work, and when you've done it, you'll never know whether you did them good, harm, or just wasted a lot of time and money and resources when you could be doing something more useful. So the recovery trial, which we established, and we wrote the protocol on the 9th and 10th of March 2020. Very simple. Anybody who goes into a hospital who has COVID could go into the study. We focused on the thing that mattered. 1 in 4 people were dying whilst they were in hospital. Can we do something about that? We randomised, back to my coin toss, between the treatments that were available, and we made it as simple as we could so that patients and doctors could take part. Anybody could design a trial that nobody can do. We had to design a trial that everybody could do in the middle of a crisis. So, as I say, very simple criteria. The criteria were admitted to hospital with COVID. We actually did rather a complicated coin toss. Our coin has multiple sides. It's almost a dice. But it essentially we compared the best the NHS can offer and then the best the NHS can offer plus one of a number of treatments. A treatment for HIV, dexamethasone, a steroid drug, hydroxychloroquine and an antibiotic. And people could get one or other of those. And we worked out what happens to people in terms of the outcome we cared about was survival for 28 days, which is a reasonable sort of example. And so, as I say, COVID can affect anyone, and the recovery trial was open to everyone. 1 in 10 patients who went into hospital with COVID over the last 2 years have taken part in this trial. We wrote the protocol, that's the first description of what the trial should be, on the 9th and 10th of March. By the 19th of March, the first patient went in. 2 months later, we had 10,000 patients. And by 100 days, we had 12,000 patients in the trial, and the first 2 answers. And you can see that, you can't see actually, but every single acute hospital in the country took part, from Stornoway up in the north to Truro down in the south, Northern Ireland across to East Anglia and so on. You can see the recruitment just about, but what you'll see in the plateaus are the sort of summer break, eat out to help out, what a good idea that is. Eat out to help out was whilst that plateau was going on, then the autumn surge, an enormous surge in January last year, when 1,000 people went into the study in 30 hours. This study was done in a way to make it easy to do, so we could get answers. Now, this is just to sort of give you a flavour of what do these people look like, what's the average person look like. Well, particularly in that early wave, many of them were in their 70s. I think a fifth of all the patients were over 80, a fifth were between 70 and 80, and the rest younger than that. The age profile has come down a bit over time. Many of them had the infection for a week, but then went into hospital. About a quarter of them at that stage didn't require oxygen, so their lungs were working. About 2/3 needed oxygen, and then some required a mechanical ventilator. And I'm going to show a few of these graphs, so I'll sort of just take a little bit of time. Again, if you don't like graphs, you can close your eyes and you'll get the message. But I think many people do understand graphs now, because I'm not the first person to be showing them in public. The graph on the left starts at day 0, the point at which the coin is tossed. And over on the bottom, that's 7 days, 14 days, 21 days, 28 days later. The bit on the upwards axis shows the proportion of people who had sadly died. And so there you can see that gradually, as day by day goes, you can see that over time we get to a point where 25% of the patients had died during the course of that first month. If we get a successful treatment, I'll show you some lines in a moment, the red lines will be below that. If we were to get a harmful treatment, it would be on the same or above that. Well, here's the answer for hydroxychloroquine. So this was early June, the 5th of June, day 76 of the entire study, and we had the first answer. And you can't see the detail at the back, but the red line is above the black line. It's actually not that different. It's not that the treatment is definitely harmful, but it's certainly no miracle drug. We announced that result within 10 days. It was the FDA, the US big drug regulator, had said this treatment should no longer be used. By and large, within 10 days, we went from this treatment being widely promoted to being hardly used at all. It didn't prevent, and I'll touch on this in questions if you like, didn't prevent a pretty significant backlash. You can imagine that saying that President Trump's favourite drug is useless is not one to endear you to a lot of people, but it does get a lot of Twitter followers. And then the real breakthrough, the 16th of June. Remember, we only started this study on the 19th of March. On the 16th of June, we had the breakthrough. We found that dexamethasone, a steroid drug, which is sitting in every hospital pharmacy, in every hospital pretty much in the world. It costs about a £5 for a course of treatment. It's easy to give. It's been known for 40 years. The side effects, there are some, but they're well known and they're manageable in this context. And what we found was that for people on ventilators, if you gave them this steroid drug, a tablet a day for 10 days, then you reduce their risk of dying by a third. For people who weren't on a ventilator but still required oxygen, which is actually a lot of, most of the people, it reduced the risk of dying by a fifth. Remember, I said at the beginning, if you could find a few drugs that reduced the risk of dying by a fifth, that would be important. For other people who were not on oxygen at all, it had no effect. So it's not for people with mild disease, it's for people with severe disease. Now, perhaps it's worth highlighting that But just as Trump and his cronies were arguing that hydroxychloroquine must be used, there are some pretty eminent professors across the UK and elsewhere saying that suppressing the immune system when you're trying to fight an infection is dangerous. You shouldn't even do the trial. They wrote to the drug regulator, the MHRA in the UK, and said you should stop this trial. Thank goodness we didn't, because here's a treatment, the first treatment that actually saves lives in this crisis, discovered within 100 days of the crisis breaking in the UK. Well, it didn't get coverage, so we announced the results. Actually, we insisted on announcing the results to the scientific and medical media first, before then going up to number 10 Downing Street for the evening briefing at 5 p.m. Now, they'd only take one person, one spokesman, and as I told you earlier, Peter Horby and I have run this trial from the beginning and all the way through. I have been to 10 Downing Street in the past for different things. Peter had never been. So we compromised and we sent Peter with my tie. So here's a picture of Peter at the number 10 briefing that evening. Well, Peter may have had the headlines there, but I don't think he can claim, you can't read it from here, stocks soar on retail outlet comeback and breakthrough coronavirus treatment. My name's buried in it, my name's here somewhere. Peter may have been to number 10. I changed the value of the US stock market that day. And that day, this treatment was adopted into NHS practice. So the Chief Medical Committee signatures, so this includes Sir Chris Whitty and a number of other Chief Medical Officers, wrote to every hospital in the country and said, basically, normally we'd say, wait for the full publication, wait for it to be reviewed, wait for the results to come through, and then we'll contemplate. And here they said, the results are so clear on something that is so important, do it now. And so within 3 hours of announcing the results, it was NHS practice. Announce the results at lunchtime, policy by tea time, saving lives by the weekend. The next morning, the headlines on the newspapers looked something like this: thousands to receive life-saving drug. The Daily Mail, 50p a day pill to conquer COVID. The Daily Express, proving that it can multiply by 10. £5 100 drugs saves lives. It's a 10-day course of treatment, got it. Coverage everywhere. I mean, that day I did my first news conference and film recording at 10:30 in the morning for BBC, and the last one at 10:30 at night for Al Jazeera. And they went out, they happened to be broadcast in the same time. And the difference in how I looked between the two. And those trial results, as I say, within hours in the UK, but within days and weeks all around the world. So the US changed their guidelines, the Europeans changed their guidelines, the Japanese changed their guidelines, the WHO changed the guidelines. This treatment became used ubiquitously for patients with COVID. Why? Because the results were clear, because we'd done the trial, because the treatment was cheap and available, because it could be implemented so fast. And none of those things were accidents. And a year later, the NHS issued another statement which says, which claims that 1 million lives have been saved worldwide as a consequence of that one intervention. Now, a year ago, I thought that was probably a little bit of an exaggeration. But a year later, I think it's an underestimate, probably, of the true number of lives have been saved by that one treatment. Well, it wasn't the only treatment, and I'm going to skip over many of the others that we've had. We have now found 4 effective treatments for these people who are in hospital at high risk. 3 of those suppress the immune system, so that the damage that the immune system does to your lungs is less, and then they improve survival. 1 of them tackles the virus itself, so the so-called monoclonal antibodies. 4 treatments, actually, each of which reduce mortality, death, by about 1/5, each of which can be used in combination. So we are now to a point where actually the risk of dying, if you like, for the same patient 2 years ago, and now compare that with today, has come down by over half. And those results, again, have been picked up all around the world, both by the lay media and by the medical media, and in publications, and importantly, in clinical practice, in the guidelines that go out to doctors about how to treat this disease. Just as importantly, We've also demonstrated 6 treatments which were widely recommended, loudly promoted, extensively used, turn out to be effectively completely useless. I'll read them out for you. On the top left-hand corner is hydroxychloroquine, we've covered that one. Lopinavir down the bottom left-hand corner is an HIV treatment. These two were the first and second choice national and international recommended treatments for COVID at the beginning. Turns out they're useless. The antibiotic is azithromycin, convalescent plasma given to 100,000 Americans as part of a study but not a randomised trial because it's too hard to randomise. Turns out to be useless. Aspirin, colchicine for this disease turned out not to be useful. And how was that covered? And I think this sort of is a helpful article in that this comes from the New York Times. It's written by a professor at University of Pennsylvania. And I don't know whether he came up with the headline or the newspaper did, I certainly didn't. Where is America's groundbreaking COVID-19 research? The US has a lot to learn from Britain. So I'll just sort of highlight the features that they highlighted because I think they're useful. First, the trial was designed so it's easy to take part in. Secondly, the whole trial was quickly approved. Anybody can delay approvals and ask more questions. You don't end up necessarily with a better decision, you just end up with a slower decision. And it was adopted by hospitals all across the UK. We did link into the National Health Service's routine healthcare data, so the data the NHS collects about us all, with consent. Leaders in government allowed the trial to happen and made sure it happened. We do have a national platform of research nurses which has been invested in over decades, and it was incorporated, really importantly, as part of everyday clinical care. So doctors knew certain things that they were doing, so they did them, and other things they didn't know, so they randomised into this trial. I'll show you a little bit of that. This, I think, is an important feature, not only for doctors, not only for the health service, but for us as patients too, that these clinical trials are actually a core component of what a good doctor does, what a good hospital does. And you can't read that, so I will. The one on the left, these are quotes coming from hospital doctors who took part in the study. And the one on the left, oh gosh, I said I would, but now it's gone dark, I can't. So the one on the left says, coming into work each day, people would say to me, they've chosen the wrong drugs. I'd say, let's see. This is a hospital consultant, actually a hospital consultant in Swindon. I didn't know this drug, turned out to be dexamethasone, would work. No one knew which drugs would work, but I thought we should help find out. 3 months on from the start of the trial, we have a treatment which is cheap and readily available, millions could benefit. I'm glad we helped contribute 1% of the data. Thank you to the patients who, when offered to participate, agreed. And I think that that speaks to the value that the trial has done, not only in terms of improving the outcomes for those patients, but actually in motivating the doctors who are here. Think what it's like being a doctor or a nurse or a pharmacist in the hospitals over the last 2 years, where you're confronted with this overwhelming burden of a disease you've never seen before and you don't know how to treat. You're exhausted, there aren't enough staff, there aren't going to be enough staff, how do you cope? And what they found was contributing to trying to find solutions was a really important motivating factor, as opposed to simply how do we tread water and hope that somebody comes to our rescue. Well, of course, we got plenty of recognition for this. On the left, there's Peter and I, a year and a bit later, I recognised in the Queen's birthday honours, which is flattering and nice, but is not our motivation. Big pieces in The Economist, in the Times, and in newspapers all around the world, a number of awards and recognition, but that's not why we do the trial. The reason we do the trial is the patients. Here is a man from Glasgow and his wife. When he left in the ambulance, I really didn't think I would ever see him again. He took part in the trial. I'm not going to say the trial saved him. He is alive, of course, because this is afterwards. But what I am going to give is a couple of quotes from the patient's perspective. This is the horror that many of us had to face. This is the reality of COVID. So again, I'm going to have to move forwards. So these are quotes from patients. So on the top left is Kimberly. Being given the opportunity to participate in the recovery trial was very humbling. Might be humbling for her. Boy, it's humbling for me. Knowing that the information they were collecting had a direct impact on the treatment of patients and signing on was something I did gladly. And at the bottom left, I read from Claire. I was already so ill that I was willing to give anything a go if it might help me recover more quickly. But I also knew that it would help the researchers studying the coronavirus to work out which treatments actually help people. I'm really glad that NHS patients can take part in the recovery trial, because otherwise no one would know what treatments work for the people actually suffering from COVID-19. To be honest, I think that's remarkable insight from somebody who was so sick with COVID, but it's absolutely the case. We do it with patients and for the patients and for the improvement of care for future patients. So that brings me back to my final couple of slides, and really what do we learn from this? Well, the first is actually that these randomised trials are not some sort of experiment that's done on guinea pigs, if you like. They're actually part of how we do medicine, how we understand how to treat diseases and improve things. Number one, arbitrary use of unproven treatments is doing damaging to patient care and to public health. So just using drugs, just prescribing something because you can, doesn't necessarily mean that you should. These randomised trials are a critical component of working out what works and what doesn't. They're part of actually how we improve the care that we can give. And then, as you've seen, if you get compelling results, it changes practice and can do so almost instantly. The trials have to be designed to actually answer the question, feasible for the people to be involved in, whether that's patients or clinical staff, inclusive of the wide range of people. I didn't touch on that, but the youngest patient was under 6 months, the oldest over 102 years, and focused on the outcomes that we all care about. And those lessons are important not just for the current, I'm afraid it is, current COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also really important for the burden of many other diseases, and particularly common diseases, heart disease, common cancers, arthritis, depression, dementia, and so on. We need answers in those cases, just as we needed answers and still need answers in COVID. My very final slide is just to say thank you. Thank you to my parents. Dad, Bob is here. Unfortunately, Mum can't be here today. And also to Debbie and to the children. Quite apart from anything in the background, if you like, the inspiration and the support and the love as I've grown up, as I've developed, but most particularly over the last 2 years, as I've been completely focused on the recovery trial and on finding treatments in a crisis. Thank you very much.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. I think you've kindly agreed to answer questions, so the floor is open if any of you have any questions.
Yeah, of course. There's a question here.
Martin, having done randomised control trials yourself, one of the biggest problems is getting ethical approval. How did you get your ethical approval so quickly, and who was it from?
Yeah, so the question is, when we do these sorts of trials, we have to get approval from what's called an independent ethics committee, which is a group set up actually under law to judge, to make sure that obviously that the trials that we're doing, when the alien clinical research that we're doing, is ethically acceptable, is a perfectly good rationale. But like all committee-type structures, can be painfully slow. The answer was that actually we were able to get we went through all the same groups that everybody else does. Because of the particular of the time, there was only one agenda item, it was COVID, and there was only, and it was ubiquitous, it was everywhere, every newspaper, which page of which newspaper you read and so on. Then there was a real focus on this. But the ethics committee actually have been fantastic. We've been through 20 different versions of this study as we've added new treatments. We won't discover one works or doesn't work, take it out. when we extend it into including children, when we extend it into including pregnant mothers, and so on and so forth, each time you go back, and they've been able to turn those around in a matter of days. So it's been an extraordinary effort. I think one of the big challenges now is to make sure that those improvements that happened in that particular crisis are held on to. The analogy I use is that in much of this we stretched a piece of elastic from the way that trials were run, the way that they were approved, the way they were governed, and so on and so forth, back in before March 2020 to now. And the question is, which end of the elastic are we going to let go on? Because there's a very serious danger that we go back to business as usual. And I'm seeing that in every walk of clinical research and indeed clinical medicine, is can we go back to where we were? It may have been comfortable, but it was not working. And we've learnt a huge amount, and we should actually improve as a consequence of that.
Yeah, does the shape of the graphs that you show us vary for different ethnicities?
Good question. So the risk of having a bad outcome does vary depending on a number of things, of which non-white ethnicity is one, older age is another, and yet a number of other features. But the value of the treatments reducing the risk of dying by a fifth remains remarkably constant across pretty much all of the different types of people, including by ethnicity. So that's one of the things that the trial can tell us is, first of all, we ask the question, does this treatment work at all? And then you immediately see the answer is yes. You say, well, in whom does it work? And how well? And because of the size of these trials, we've been able to look at that. By and large, you get consistent results, particularly with regards to ethnicity.
I'm a retired medical journal editor, and one of the things that went very fast was publication.
Yes.
What lessons do you think we've learned about peer review and rapid publication?
Okay, so again, for people who can't hear or for the recording, as a retired medical journal editor, one of the things we've learned is about publication. I think there have been a few things. Not everything that's published and so-called peer reviewed, in other words, the way that medical publishing works is I send something into, let's say, the Lancet. They send it out to half a dozen experts who, also called experts, I mean, as in some of them are more expert than others. They provide a bunch of comments, which may or may not be as informed. Some are really good and some are not so good. And then we have to we play this sort of negotiation about how we can answer their questions without actually detracting from the paper. And eventually the journal editor says, well, yes, maybe we pass the mark and then it goes in. It's heavily reliant on the quality of that peer review. And given that that peer review is mostly for free, and the most expert people are usually busy doing whatever the most expert people do, there are some challenges around that. As I say, it also, on the flip side, is intended to safeguard from people making data up, making the story up, overselling their own story, and so on and so forth. So there are pros and cons to it. Well, our approach was this. The very first result, the dexamethasone result, we actually announced that without any form of publication at the time. And one of the reasons for that was because it sort of landed on us so early, we weren't actually even ready to back to publication. And the second was, it was so clear, we spent a week sitting on the results trying to work out if we could, if you like, break it, make sure it was true. And then you're sat with a disease which is killing thousands with no treatment, and a result that is saying it's a drug that's sitting in everybody's cupboard that could be used instantly. And there comes a point at which we just seemed we couldn't hold on to that result anymore for, if you like, the niceties of peer review. We actually use almost all our articles now, we send to so-called preprint, so technical, but for everybody else. This is basically, the version I send to, let's say, the Lancet, I also send, and you can actually then read it online almost instantly, the full thing that I sent to the Lancet. You have to sort of read it with a pinch of salt because it hasn't been through the checking process, and some things might change, but it at least means that the full details are out there for everybody else to do. I actually think that worked quite well because you get more peer reviews. Everybody's a peer reviewer then, and then we submit it. But I think that for the journals, there is a question about whether they really can handle this. They handle either the combination of volume and speed, and some of the early public, and the third element is there is, depending on the journal, a commercial interest in publishing stories that people will read. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the right articles that actually provide the most definitive information. So all that hydroxychloroquine stuff from Didier Raoult, the Frenchman, that was published in the Lancet. But it was a rubbish study of about, 80 people. It wasn't done well. Nobody actually is quite clear whether the data is straight or whatever. But it was published in the Lancet, because the Lancet sort of didn't want to miss out. And then it was heavily quoted from there on. So I think that there are some real challenges. I hope that sort of deals with it in a way that we can now. There was another question.
I was just wondering what you thought about whether, as a country, we've learned anything, and are we any more prepared for the next new virus?
Right. Are we any more prepared for the next pandemic than this one? Well, I think the first thing to be careful of is, as I said earlier, it's tempting to try and go back to business as usual, and that is a serious mistake, because that's not learning the lessons of the last 2 years. The second thing is to prepare for the next pandemic like it's going to be a rerun of this one. It's a little bit like building the Maginot Line or whatever. You're preparing for World War II as if it's going to be the same as World War I. It turns out that each pandemic is quite different. The different viruses, for example, behave quite differently. About how they infect people, how long they take to infect people, the proportion of people who get infected who get seriously ill, all these other things. We were also lucky in this context, I didn't mention it, but vaccines came through very, very quickly. Now, when I started out the trial, we didn't know whether we'd get a vaccine at all. We still haven't got a vaccine for HIV. We didn't know whether we'd get a vaccine anytime soon. We got one within a year, and we were able to roll it out within a year. But that was not a given. But there has been some quite good work led by Patrick Vallance, Chief Scientist for the government, and particularly sponsored by the G7. So in June last year, the UK was presidency of the G7, and there was a whole set of work around the pandemic, which I was involved in, which was really saying, what do we need to do? They called it the 100 days mission. How can we get within 100 days to have decent diagnostics, decent tests, decent vaccines and decent treatments available for wide-scale use? We might still need to do some of the later phase trials and whatever else, but how can we get ourselves in a good position? It's a very good document, but there's a real danger that it will do what all documents do. It'll get dusty on a shelf somewhere as people move on to the next crisis. My lessons: one, you've got to invest in the long term. All the things that worked because they were built on a group of people or institutes who were already very well established and well trained. So, I've been running trials in cardiac disease, heart disease and kidney disease for 20 years. This was a new disease, but at least I knew how to run a trial. The vaccine people, Sarah Gilbert and colleagues, have been developing how to work new technology for vaccines for 10, 15 years. The mRNA vaccines, they've been working in the quiet, out of the limelight for 10 years. These are things and structures that are in place. The testing, the PCR testing at the Lighthouse Labs, when you actually look at the early films of that, you'll see all the machines have University of Manchester, University of Oxford and so on, all printed on the side of them. They were taken out of the university labs and stuck into those labs for this purpose. But the machines weren't the key to it, it was the people, and the people were people who were researchers, by and large, in the university setting, who've been trained for years and years about how you do this sort of technology. So investing long term in the people that underpin the science and underpin the health service are important. So when I was asked lots about this early on, I said, well, we used to think of science and health as being drains on the economy, as being a luxury to have. Actually, I'd say what we really saw over the last 2 years was if you don't have good science, you don't have a good health system, you don't have good education, you have no economy. And I think that to me, would be, if I were a politician, and I'm not, I have no intention of being a politician, that I think would be the key lesson I would know. Oh, there's one question at the back.
With so much data and reporting with you able to monitor and verify the data efficiently?
So the question was, how do we know the data is, and it's essentially, there's so much data, how do we know it's structured? The answer to that is that we were, most of the things we were assessing were very clear cut. Dead or alive is black or white, if you like. How long people are in hospital is fairly straightforward data and so on. The second answer is that we were able to do this particularly by linking through to existing systems. So, you can't die in this country without a death certificate being filled in. We were able to get hold of all the death certificates electronically. You can't go into an NHS hospital in this country without the NHS recording when you went into hospital, when you came out, what diagnoses you had while you were there. We were able to link through to that. We were also able to do it from several different sources at once, so that if something was a bit scruffy, recorded a little bit not so well in one database, you'd find it in another, and you couldn't work out how you match those things. So we were able to use both the fact that the data was sort of, if you like, relatively clear cut, but also the fact that we had it from multiple sources as a way of making sure that we had robust findings.
Do we have any more questions? Well, we're not keeping you till 10:30 tonight asking questions. Martin, thank you so much for giving so generously of your time today. A small thank you present for you. Thank you once again, and thank you on behalf of the 1 million+ lives that you have worked to save. Thank you.